Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the most shocking, thrilling, and unforgettable moments of your favorite daytime dramas. Today is a beautiful day to unravel the darkest secrets hidden behind the glamorous facades of Los Angeles, where ambition often demands the ultimate bloody price. The Spencer Beach House has long stood as a sanctuary of romance, a sun-drenched haven where the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean effortlessly drown out the chaotic noise of the Los Angeles fashion world. For Will Spencer, this beautiful architectural masterpiece was meant to be a safe harbor, a place where he could rebuild his fractured life and offer shelter to the woman he believed he loved. He had opened his doors to Melissa Dillon, viewing her as a fragile, misunderstood soul who desperately needed a champion against the relentless manipulations of R.J. Forrester and the scheming of his own family. However, the serene illusion of this coastal paradise was destined to be shattered in the most grotesque and unimaginable way possible. The walls that were supposed to protect them from the outside world instead became the silent, horrified witnesses to a descent into absolute madness, transforming his sanctuary of love into a gruesome slaughterhouse of desperation and cold-blooded survival. The nightmare began when the shadows of Melissa Dillon's past finally caught up with her in the form of Remy Price. For days, Remy had been the sinister, disguised voice on the other end of the telephone, a terrifying phantom who haunted her every waking moment with promises of unfinished business. But phantoms are far less terrifying than flesh and blood, and when Remy physically cornered Dillon within the isolated confines of the beach house, the true gravity of her situation crashed down upon her. Remy was not just a ghost from her history. He was the architect of her initial entry into the privileged world she now inhabited, the man who had pulled strings to secure her previous job as an art teacher. Now he had returned to collect his pound of flesh, wielding a sinister blackmail plot that threatened to rip away everything she had fought so desperately to achieve. Remy's demands were not merely financial. They were deeply psychological, designed to exert absolute control over a woman who had finally found a foothold in the glamorous halls of Forrester Creations. As he paced the expensive hardwood floors of the Spencer Beach House, Remy taunted Dillon with the fragility of her new existence. He knew about her newly acquired position as the assistant to Daphne Rose Walton, a role that placed her in the inner circle of one of the most powerful fashion dynasties in the world. With a cruel, mocking smile, Remy detailed exactly how he would dismantle her life. He threatened to march directly into the Forrester executive offices and expose the darkest, most unsavory chapters of her past to Ridge and Steffi Forrester. He promised to paint her not as a dedicated employee, but as a deceitful, manipulative liability, ensuring that she would be stripped of her job, her reputation, and her newfound status before the sun set. For Melissa Dillon, the threat of losing her job at Forrester Creations was not just a matter of professional setback. It was an existential terror that struck at the very core of her survival instincts. As Remy's cruel words echoed through the living room, a visceral, paralyzing panic began to rise in Dillon's chest. She was violently thrust back into the traumatic memories of her past, a time when she was entirely devoid of safety, warmth, and dignity. The mere thought of returning to a life of homelessness, of shivering through freezing nights in the cramped back seat of her car, of the gnawing, relentless hunger that consumed her every waking thought, was a fate worse than death. The Forrester job was her lifeline, her golden ticket out of the gutter, and the beach house was her fortress. Remy was threatening to burn it all to the ground, and in that agonizing moment of realization, the fragile, timid Melissa Dillon ceased to exist. In her place emerged a cornered, desperate animal, a woman whose psychological breaking point had been violently breached. The human mind is a fragile construct, and when pushed to the absolute brink of survival, the veneer of civilization is rapidly stripped away, leaving only raw, primal instinct. Dillon looked at Remy not as a human being, but as a lethal threat to her very existence. The terror in her eyes rapidly crystallized into a dark, unyielding resolve. She was not going to go back to the streets. She was not going to let this smug, manipulative ghost from her past dictate her future. She had tasted the intoxicating nectar of wealth, security, and status, and she was willing to pay any price, commit any sin, to maintain her grip on it. The moral boundaries that separate right from wrong evaporated in the heat of her absolute desperation. The physical environment of the beach house, previously a symbol of luxury, suddenly became an armory of lethal potential. As Remy continued to sneer, completely underestimating the lethal volatility of the woman he was cornering, Dylan's frantic eyes darted across the room. They locked onto a heavy, solid bronze decorative statue resting on a nearby console table. It was an object of art, a symbol of Will Spencer's refined taste, but in Dylan's hands, it was destined to become an instrument of brutal, unforgiving violence. The adrenaline surging through her veins drowned out the sound of the crashing waves outside, narrowing her entire universe down to the heavy weight of the bronze in her hands and the back of Remy Price's head. With a sudden, explosive burst of kinetic energy, Dylan lunged forward. There was no hesitation, no cry of warning, only the terrifying silence of a predator striking its prey. She swung the heavy bronze statue with every ounce of strength her desperate body could muster. The impact was sickeningly loud, a wet, heavy thud that instantly shattered the illusion of safety within the room. Remy's eyes widened in absolute, uncomprehending shock as his knees buckled beneath him. But Dylan did not stop. The dam had broken, and the pent-up terror, rage, and desperation of her entire life poured out in a relentless, frenzied assault. She struck him again and again, the heavy object rising and falling in a gruesome rhythm, until the man who had threatened to destroy her life lay completely motionless, his skull crushed against the expensive, blood-soaked rug of the Spencer Beach house. The immediate aftermath of the violence was characterized by an eerie, suffocating silence. The rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves slowly bled back into the room, a stark contrast to the horrific tableau of death that now stained the floor. Remy Price was dead, his life extinguished in a brutal explosion of desperate rage. Yet, as Dylan stood over his mangled, lifeless body, her chest heaving with exertion, a chilling transformation occurred. The frantic, terrified woman who had swung the statue vanished, replaced by an entity of terrifying, sociopathic detachment. There were no tears of regret, no screams of horror at what she had done. Instead, her eyes, dark and entirely devoid of humanity, systematically scanned the room, calculating the necessary steps to preserve her pristine, newly acquired life. With the cold, mechanical precision of a seasoned predator, Dylan transitioned from a brutal murderer into a meticulous janitor. She carefully set the bloodied bronze statue aside and moved swiftly to the utility closet. When she returned, she was armed with heavy-duty bleach, a bucket of water, and a stack of thick towels. Dropping to her knees beside the mutilated corpse of her blackmailer, Dylan began to scrub. The pungent, chemical stench of the bleach mixed violently with the heavy, metallic odor of fresh blood, creating a nauseating olfactory nightmare that permeated the entire house. She scrubbed the hardwood floors with relentless determination, her face an unreadable mask of absolute apathy. She was not washing away the guilt of taking a human life. She was simply erasing a logistical obstacle that stood between her and her desk at Forster Creations. It was into this macabre, unimaginable nightmare that Will Spencer unknowingly walked. Will had spent his drive home consumed by thoughts of love, loyalty, and the future he hoped to build with Dylan. He had fiercely defended her against the relentless warnings of R.J. Forrester, who had sworn that Dylan was a manipulative force tearing Will and Electra apart. Will had dismissed R.J.'s concerns as the jealous ravings of a rival, firmly believing in the inherent goodness and vulnerability of the woman he had invited into his home. He believed he was her savior, her protector against a cruel world. As he turned his key in the lock of the beach house door, he expected to be greeted by the warm, grateful smile of the woman he loved, entirely unprepared for the catastrophic shattering of his reality that awaited him just steps away. The moment Will pushed the front door open, his senses were violently assaulted. The beach house, usually filled with the fresh, salty breeze of the ocean, was choked with a thick, suffocating stench. It was the sharp, burning scent of industrial bleach layered over a heavy, sickeningly sweet metallic odor that Will's brain struggled to immediately identify. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was heavy, pregnant with a dark, unspoken horror. Frowning in confusion, Will called out Dylan's name, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, open concept space. When no answer came, a creeping sense of dread began to coil in his stomach. He slowly walked down the hallway, the nauseating smell growing stronger with every step, until he rounded the corner into the main living area, and his entire world abruptly stopped spinning. The sight that greeted Will Spencer was so profoundly horrific, so entirely divorced from reality, that his mind temporarily refused to process the visual information. There, in the center of his beautiful living room, lay the brutalized, blood-soaked corpse of Remy Price. And kneeling right beside the body, her hands stained crimson and her clothes splattered with gore, was Melissa Dillon. She was rhythmically, methodically scrubbing the floor with a bleach-soaked towel, the harsh scraping sound echoing loudly in the silent room. Will stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes wide with an absolute, paralyzing terror. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, the vibrant colors of his home draining away into a monochromatic nightmare of red and white. Dylan Will finally manage to choke out, his voice a frail, trembling whisper that barely cut through the heavy air. The scraping sound abruptly stopped. Slowly, with a terrifying, deliberate calmness, Melissa Dillon turned her head to look up at him. Will braced himself for the hysterical tears, the frantic explanations, the agonizing guilt of a tragic accident. But what he saw in her eyes chilled him to the absolute marrow of his bones. There was no panic. There was no sorrow. There was no trace of the fragile, vulnerable woman he had sworn to protect. Her eyes were completely empty, dark, and shark-like, reflecting a terrifying void of human empathy. She looked at Will not as a lover seeking comfort, but as an unexpected variable in her cleanup process. "He was going to ruin everything, Will," Dylan stated, her voice eerily steady, devoid of a single tremor of emotion. She didn't drop the bloody towel. She didn't reach out to him. She simply stated the facts of the murder with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "He was going to go to the Foresters. He was going to tell them about my past. I would have lost my job with Daphne. I would have had to go back to sleeping in my car. I couldn't let him do that. I saw my life back." The words hung in the toxic air, a grotesque rationalization that entirely prioritized her corporate status and comfort over the sanctity of a human life. She was not apologizing for the brutal murder of Remy Price. She was merely explaining the necessary administrative steps she had taken to protect her career. In that agonizing, suspended moment, the illusions that Will Spencer had so carefully constructed around Melissa Dillon violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The profound, sickening realization washed over him with the force of tidal wave. R.J. Forrester had been right to warn him that Dillon was dangerous. But even R.J. could never have comprehended the true depth of the darkness that resided within her. Will had believed he was shielding a victim of circumstance, a wounded bird that needed his protection. Instead, he realized with absolute, mind-numbing clarity that he had invited a cold-blooded, remorseless sociopath into his home. He had fallen in love with a monster wearing the skin of a victim, a killer who was willing to bludgeon a man to death and calmly scrub his blood from the floor just to ensure she could show up to work at Forster Creations the next morning. The sound of the ocean waves crashing against the shore outside suddenly seemed deafening, a mocking soundtrack to the absolute destruction of Will's life. He was trapped in a room with a corpse and a killer, the metallic stench of blood permanently etching itself into his memory. Melissa Dillon simply returned her gaze to the floor, her bloody hands resuming their rhythmic scrubbing, entirely consumed by the singular, terrifying goal of preserving her status at any cost. The Spencer Beach house, once a beacon of hope and romance, had become a tomb, and Will Spencer was now locked inside it with the terrifying truth of the woman he loved. The glamorous world of Los Angeles fashion, with all its wealth and beauty, had just exacted its most gruesome toll, proving that beneath the designer clothes and the corporate titles, the most dangerous